The year was 1872, deep inside the wild and unforgiving lands of New Mexico Territory. A woman lifted a blanket, and the man beneath it whispered only 4 chilling words, "Kill me fast." What she saw changed her life forever. Under the burning sun of the Chihuahuan Desert, on August 17, 1872, the silence of New Mexico Territory carried a weight that pressed hard against Clara's heart as she walked the lonely trail, her steps heavy but unbroken, her eyes searching the endless horizon for something more than just survival. For she had already lost everything that made life worth living when her family was taken from her in a brutal raid. Yet here she was, a woman carved by grief but held together by sheer courage, clutching the small bag that carried the last traces of her past, her mind whispering doubts with every gust of desert wind but her spirit refusing to bend. And though the land was cruel and the nights colder than memory itself, Clara knew that somewhere along this unforgiving road her fate was waiting, wrapped in danger, shadowed by mystery, and destined to test the limits of her heart. As Clara pressed forward through the endless stretch of sand and thorn, her weary eyes caught the faint outline of smoke stains rising above a cluster of rocks ahead. And though her instincts urged caution, her heart pulled her closer, for she had not seen another living soul in days, and the thought of finding a sign of life stirred both fear and fragile hope within her. Yet when she reached the abandoned campsite, the air felt colder than the desert wind, as if it carried secrets unspoken, and there, beneath the dying shade of a mesquite tree, she saw a shape lying still, wrapped in a dusty army blanket that looked as though it had witnessed more battles than one man should ever endure. And her breath caught in her throat as she stepped nearer, for the silence around him was unnerving, broken only by the faint rasp of shallow breaths, each one weaker than the last. And she knew instantly that this stranger had been left behind to face death alone. But questions clawed at her mind like restless ghosts. Who was he? Why was he here without a soul to watch over him? And what tragedy had scattered his companions across the merciless desert? For no soldier abandons his unit without reason. No army blanket is draped so carelessly unless there is more to the story than what meets the eye. And as she knelt down, the weight of his fragile existence pressed upon her heart, her trembling hand hovering just above his shoulder, torn between pulling back to protect herself and reaching forward to uncover the truth, while the silence stretched longer, heavy and suffocating, until the faintest whisper of life beneath that blanket seemed to beg her not to turn away. And though her courage had been tested by grief, the sight of this broken stranger forced Clara to confront a deeper choice. For in that moment the desert no longer felt empty but alive with secrets, every gust of wind carrying whispers of betrayal, every shadow stretching long as if to hide the scars of battles unseen. And she realized that fate had led her to a crossroads where Hohn's story would entwine with his, binding them in a mystery far greater than her lonely journey across the New Mexico frontier, a mystery that began with a single question echoing in her heart. Why was this man left to die under a sky so wide? And what truth would rise when the blanket was finally lifted? Clara's fingers trembled as they hovered above the stranger's shoulder, her pulse hammering in her ears as though the desert itself had gone silent to watch what she would do. And then, without warning, the man's eyelids fluttered open, his gaze clouded with pain yet sharp enough to pierce through her soul. And before she could draw back, his cracked lips parted and a sound escaped, so faint it seemed carried by the wind, but the words struck her like a blade to the chest. "Kill me fast." And in that instant her breath caught, her body frozen in disbelief, her mind spinning in circles around the impossible plea. For what kind of man, wounded and clinging to the last thread of life, would choose death over the smallest chance of survival? And her heart pounded harder as she stared into the hollow depths of his eyes, eyes that held secrets darker than the night that would soon fall upon the desert, eyes that revealed more agony than any wound she could see. And her throat tightened as questions stormed within her. Was it madness? Was it fear? Or was it a truth too unbearable to face? And though her instincts screamed to step back, to abandon this stranger whose presence promised only danger, another force within her refused to move. For she had known loss, she had felt despair, but never had she heard it spoken with such raw surrender. And in that fragile silence that followed his whisper, Clara felt as though the air itself had thickened, the desert pressing against her chest as if demanding she answer the unspoken challenge. Yet no answer came, only the sound of her shallow breathing and his desperate exhale. And still his gaze clung to hers as if begging her to understand a story she had not yet heard. And the ground beneath her knees seemed to tilt, the world narrowing to the weight of those 3 words that echoed like a curse inside her head. Until at last her trembling voice broke the silence, though barely more than a whisper, as she asked why. But the man's eyes closed again as if the effort of speech had drained the last of his strength, his chest rising and falling unevenly, leaving Clara with the haunting knowledge that whatever horrors had brought him to this state were now hers to uncover. For fate had placed the burden upon her shoulders, and though her heart screamed in protest, her soul understood that she could not turn away, not now, not after hearing the most chilling request a human could give. And so she sat frozen, caught between fear and compassion. While the desert sun bled into the horizon and shadows crept across the sand, whispering of the darkness still to come, Clara's breath trembled in her chest, as the fading light of the desert evening wrapped the campsite in shadows. And though every instinct warned her to walk away, to leave the stranger to whatever cruel fate had already claimed him, something stronger held her still, a force born not of logic but of the aching memory of her own losses. And with hands that shook against her while she reached for the edge of the dusty blanket, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric that smelled of sweat, blood, and dust. And with one slow pull she uncovered the truth that he had tried to hide beneath its weight, her eyes widening as the dim glow revealed a body marked by torment. Not the clean wounds of battle, but the cruel evidence of deliberate pain. His chest scarred by old cuts and burns, his arms lined with bruises deep and fresh, and across his side a bullet wound poorly bandaged with torn cloth, seeping faint traces of blood that had dried under the desert heat. And though his injuries looked brutal, they were not mortal, not yet, for his breath still came shallow but steady, and the sight of him alive despite such cruelty made her heart twist between fear and pity. For she had never seen a man left in such a state, broken by violence yet breathing as if clinging stubbornly to life. And the questions rose sharp inside her: what kind of monsters had done this? What purpose had they in torturing him only to abandon him in the wilderness? And why had they left him alive when death would have been easier? But no answers came, only the silence of the desert stretching heavy around them, broken by his faint groan as the cool air touched his wounds. And Clara felt her stomach knot as her eyes traced every scar, each one a story of suffering she could not yet know. And her heart ached with a fragile compassion she tried to resist, for pity could mean danger. Pity could bind her to a man who carried enemies that might soon return. Yet she could not look away, could not harden herself against the raw humanity of his broken form. And in that moment she understood that fate had drawn her into a storm far larger than her own grief, a storm that whispered of outlaws and betrayal and truths buried deep beneath the desert sands. And as she sat with the blanket clutched in her hands, her pulse racing in her ears, she realized that whatever had scarred this stranger had already begun to scar her. For now she carried the weight of knowing, and with it the terrible responsibility of choosing whether to leave him to die alone, or to risk her life discovering the mystery of why his enemies had chosen suffering over death. His lips quivered as though the act of speaking cost him more strength than his battered body could afford. Yet when Clara's gaze held steady, refusing to turn away, the stranger forced a shallow breath and let words escape, rough and broken but heavy with truth. And in that fragile voice he gave her a name, Ethan before his eyes flickered toward the darkening horizon as if afraid the shadows themselves were listening, and with every word he spoke she felt the weight of a story carved in blood and betrayal. For he revealed he had been a scout for the U.S. Army, guiding his unit across these treacherous trails when ruthless bandits struck under the veil of dust and gunfire. Their ambush swift and merciless, leaving soldiers scattered like fallen leaves across the desert floor. And though Ethan fought to lead them on, his warnings drowned in chaos until he was torn from his men, beaten, bound, and marked by hands that carried no mercy. And he whispered that the outlaws sought information, maps and routes of supply, but when his silence held firm, they left him broken, convinced the desert would finish what they had begun. Yet somehow life clung to him in defiance of their cruelty. And now, lying beneath the weight of his scars, he begged her not to waste her courage on a man who carried death in his shadow, his cracked voice warning that, if she stayed, she too would be swallowed when those men returned to finish what they had started. And Clara felt her chest tighten as his words pierced through her resolve, for every syllable carried the truth of danger. Every rasping breath painted the image of riders on the horizon, ruthless eyes scanning for the one they had failed to kill. Yet even as fear threatened to root her to the ground, another force stirred deep within her, a quiet fire that refused to let pity be drowned by caution. But Ethan's gaze held hers, desperate, pleading for her to understand that helping him would mean risking more than her own life. It would mean inviting the wrath of men who thrived on torment. And still he whispered that his story was not worth her sacrifice, that her steps across the desert should carry her far from this place before the night brought riders back with steel and fire. And his hand, trembling and weak, tried to push hers away as if to set her free, yet his eyes betrayed him, filled with sorrow that spoke louder than his warnings. And Clara in that moment felt the battle within herself rage louder than the silence of the desert, torn between the weight of fear and the pull of compassion, knowing that the choice she made beside this wounded scout would shape not only his fate but her own. Clara's hands tightened against the torn blanket as Ethan's broken plea echoed inside her chest. And though every word urged her to turn away, to vanish into the desert night before shadows returned with iron and fire, her heart refused to bend. For the memory of her own family's last cry still haunted her sleepless nights. The raid that had left her alone etched like a scar upon her soul. And in the hollow silence that followed Ethan's confession, she felt the same cruel hand of fate pressing upon her once more, asking if she would abandon another soul to the emptiness she had endured. And as she looked at his trembling frame, she knew that walking away would not save her. It would only chain her spirit in guilt as heavy as the desert stones. So she fought the fear that clawed at her, drawing strength from the pain of what she had lost, whispering inside herself that perhaps this choice was not about survival alone, but about refusing to let death write every chapter of her story. And though her voice trembled when she spoke, it carried a fierce resolve, telling Ethan that she would not leave him, that his suffering would not end with solitude beneath a cold sky. And his eyes widened in disbelief, sorrow and hope colliding in a single glance. But still he shook his head faintly, insisting that her mercy would draw death upon them both. Yet Clara's spirit had already crossed the line where fear could hold her back. For she remembered the flames that devoured her past and knew she could not bear to see another life vanish while she stood by. And with her decision carved in stone, she set her jaw and reached for her small bag. Pulling free what little she carried, strips of cloth, a flask of water, and a handful of herbs she had gathered along the trail, her hand steady though her pulse raced. And as she pressed the cool fabric against his wounds, Ethan's face twisted with both pain and disbelief, his cracked voice whispering that she was signing her own death. But she silenced him with a steady gaze that spoke louder than words. And in that fragile exchange she felt her own strength rise. Not the strength of weapons or numbers, but the unyielding will of a woman who had lost everything yet still refused to surrender to despair. And as the desert wind curled around them carrying the scent of dust and the promise of nightfall, Clara knew that her choice had bound her to this wounded scout, that together their fates were now woven into a single thread pulled tight against the storm. And though danger lurked beyond the horizon, her heart no longer wavered, for she had chosen to fight not only for his life but for the part of herself that still believed hope could survive in the wild silence of New Mexico with the night. Pressing close around them, Clara half carried Ethan toward the jagged rocks where a shallow cave offered shelter from the cold wind. And there by the dim flicker of her lantern she cleaned his wounds with trembling care, pressing herbs against torn flesh and binding him with strips of cloth until his breathing steadied. And though his face twisted with pain, his eyes never left her as if searching for the reason. She had not abandoned him to the silence of the desert. And when at last exhaustion softened the sharp lines of his suffering, he reached for her hand with the last of his strength, his grip faint but alive. And in a voice raw with gratitude, he whispered words that struck deeper than any wound. "You didn't kill me. You gave me a reason to live." And Clara felt her chest tighten as tears blurred her sight. For in saving him she had unknowingly saved herself. And as dawn broke across the New Mexico horizon, painting the desert gold, they set out toward the distant fort, fragile yet unbroken, carrying with them a hope carved from pain, for sometimes the harshest land still grows the strongest hearts. And every story of survival asks the same question: if you were Clara, would you risk everything for a stranger? Or walk away, leaving the desert to decide his fate? Think on it and share your heart in the comments. And if stories of courage, loss, and the wild frontier move you, ride with us again by liking, sharing, subscribing, and watching more Tailies at Western Stories, where every ending carries the spirit of the untamed land.